It's our great privilege today to be speaking with Dr. Leland Ryken. Dr. Ryken served as professor of English at Wheaton College for nearly 50 years and is the author or editor of over 50 books. He also served as the literary stylist recently for the English Standard Version of the Bible. We're here today to be speaking with him about his recent book, J.I. Packer, An Evangelical Life. Dr. Ryken, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's a pleasure.
Dr. Ryken, one of your stated goals in this tremendous biography of J.I. Packer is that the reader would become acquainted with the man as a human being. And it seems to me that you know just about everything about J.I. Packer. In one of the chapters that you entitled The Little Known Packer, you detail everything about the man's life, from how he used to climb 2 stairs at a time to his love for spicy curry food. In your preparation of this portrait of J.I. Packer, was there anything that particularly surprised you?
There were a lot of surprises. Now, a surprise implies a challenge to a perception that exists. So the J.I. Packer that I knew was a speaker, an author, and a fellow member of the translation committee of the English Standard Version. That person was a formal person. To me, Packer is the quintessential Britisher. So when I pictured him in the pulpit or behind the lectern, I saw a formal man. Now, it's true that the committee meetings were informal, but Packer's words and phraseology are so aptly chosen that even that seemed formal. All right, with that as the baseline, here are some surprises. The extent of Packer's acquaintance with children's literature and the ease with which he makes reference to children's literature in his writings. This past Sunday, I dipped into 2 of Packer's late books, and one of them had an extended reference and use of Winnie the Pooh, and the other of the Peanuts cartoon. So Packer, the devotee of children's literature, but even more than that, his willingness as this very famous person to put it right there in his writings, that surprised me. I would never have guessed that J.I. Packer was so thoroughly read in detective fiction as he is. He wrote a column in Christianity Today listing the fiction writers that he has read, and half of the authors I had never even heard of. That surprised me. Here's the theologian sitting down to read detective fiction. Packer is extremely widely read, even though he writes and speaks. I was surprised that a person with that busy a schedule could find time to read so much. He reads certain books every year, rereads them every year. Who would think, seeing Packer behind the pulpit, that he is an absolute devotee of jazz music? This dates back to age 13. He was listening to classical music on the family radio. The person in charge of the program had a brief interlude between main music that he was playing of jazz music. Packer records going to the radio, putting his ear next to the radio, listening to Steamboat Stomp by Jelly Roll Morton. That was a surprise to me. I knew Packer as a kind of evangelical Calvinist. That's my tradition. That's the venues in which I saw him. I was extremely surprised to be aware of the depth of his Anglicanism. He knows the prayer book so well that when he goes for a 30-minute morning walk, he can recite the morning service to himself from the prayer book. He's a thoroughgoing Anglican. That was a surprise to me. When I got started on this biography, I hosted what I call a launch lunch at a local restaurant with 3 Crossway editors, and they spoke of the disappointments that Packer had endured. Well, I had no idea that this successful man and famous man had had his share of disappointments in life. That was a surprise to me. And a final one I'll mention for us is that I'd always noticed a somewhat oddly shaped head, but I never made anything of it. Well, I discovered that he has a dent in the side of his head, and it dates all the way back to an accident that he had being hit by a bread van in a busy street in Gloucester, England, at the age of 7. So there were a lot of surprises.
Dr. Ryken, thank you. Dr. Ryken, I think many of us think of J.I. Packer only as this tremendously influential evangelical theologian. You've alluded to some disappointments that he weathered in his life. Would you be willing to name one or two of those disappointments?
When he finished a 10-year tenure, the 1960s, at Latimer House, he was looking for a new teaching position. So he applied and did not receive those appointments. All right, we could reach back earlier in his life. When he finished his theological education, he wrote to John Stott at All Souls Church, inquiring whether Stott would be interested in having him join the pastoral staff, and Stott declined that. After the decade at Latimer House, which was an Anglican clearinghouse, and during the 1960s, as president or warden there, Packer was a high visibility Anglican among the evangelicals. During the ensuing decade, he went into decline in terms of his influence. His agenda of grassroots education for the layperson lost out to John Stott's vision of getting Anglican evangelical pastors together, mingling socially, and hoping for a trickle-down effect, so that by the time Packer moved to Canada in 1979, he had largely lost his influence in England. So that was a disappointment.
Dr. Ryken, many of us know J.I. Packer best for his book, the 1973 book, Knowing God. How is it that this book has come to be a modern-day theological classic, and what does this book, Knowing God, tell us about J.I. Packer as an author and theologian?
That's a great question. Knowing God is Packer's most famous book, but that surprised him. When he wrote a preface to the 25-year anniversary of that book, he shared that he was totally surprised that this book became a bestseller or a classic. This book epitomizes Packer's writing. It began as a series of magazine articles. A female editor of a little-known magazine called Evangelical magazine asked for a series of articles that tackled the tough questions about God. I will say in passing, Packer's career has been a case study of entering pretty much every open door in terms of speaking engagements and writing engagements. No venue is too small or modest for J.I. Packer. All right, these articles appeared every 2 months over a span of 5 years, if you can imagine. Packer describes himself as sitting down every 2 months and asking, "What shall I tell them next?" Well, that says a lot about Packer. If I may just already now quote the subtitle of a book of essays on Packer, Doing Theology for the People of God. That is exactly right. That is what J.I. Packer has done. So he asked, not what is the next topic that a systematic theology would take up? No, what shall I tell them next? What do they need to know about God? This book, in effect, was turned down initially. Not absolutely, but when the articles were complete and Packer wanted to get this book published, he approached the InterVarsity editor, who wanted Packer first to write a book on the Holy Spirit and the charismatic controversy that was waging. So Packer went to Houghton and found it as a publisher. But the point is, the book was initially turned down in a sense. It is a book of theology for the layperson, not the specialist. It's a successful book. Well, the author, there are 2 million copies sold. And it's a very influential book. So that epitomizes Packer's life as a writer. A Christianity Today poll asked, what are the books that have most shaped evangelicals? And Packer's Knowing God came out 5th on that list.
Dr. Ryken, J.I. Packer, of course, writes the afterword to your fine biography, and he writes this: though professionally a professor, my main trajectory of concern has always been ministerial and ecclesial rather than narrowly academic. In what ways did J.I. Packer step outside of the bounds of the traditional academy in order to minister to the church?
Let me again cite that subtitle that is so apt: Doing Theology for the People of God. Not as a contribution to the discipline, as an academician would say it. No, for the people of God. I will observe in passing that in an online interview, Packer, when asked, well, what's the problem with theological education? He said that theological education took a wrong turn when scholars with PhDs went directly from graduate school to the teaching profession without having a stint as a parish minister. So that says a lot right there. Packer can write specialized scholarship and occasionally does. For example, his dissertation published as a book on Richard Baxter. Or I think of an introduction to the works of Thomas Cranmer that Packer wrote. Really beautiful, specialized scholarship. But that's the exception. He can do it. He writes mid-level scholarship. A bright high school student can understand most of what J.I. Packer writes. Packer himself has been devoid of careerism. Now, he's had the advantage of teaching at places where he didn't have to play the career game, but that's been to his and the Christian world's advantage that he did not have to. He never was preoccupied with whether this or that publication, quote, would count when it comes to tenure considerations. He didn't have to worry about that. I've already said he entered pretty much every open door in terms of publishing and speaking. Let's just take his unwritten systematic theology as a kind of barometer. For 3 decades, Packer has been under contract to produce a systematic theology. Professional theologians are bent out of shape that he has not written this systematic theology. For most theologians, the kind of crown of a career would be to write a systematic theology. All right. Packer's pretty unconcerned about the unwritten systematic theology. He claims to still be working on it. People are skeptical that it will appear during his lifetime. If it appears, it is going to be an expression of what he currently sees his vocation as being that of a catechist. Now, by that he means a systematic treatment of theology, but for the layperson and the church, not an academic systematic theology. So if it appears, it's going to be like the book Knowing God, a person for the educated layperson.
Mm-hmm. This is a fascinating insider information. Thank you, Dr. Ryken, for that. And Dr. Ryken, can I ask you further to expound on this? You have alluded that J.I. Packer lost out, I believe the expression was, to John Stott's vision of doing theological education by the Langham what we now know as the Langham Partnership. What was J.I. Packer's original vision for a more grassroots model of theological education?
I think it is epitomized by his decade when he was warden at Latimer House. Latimer House was a house in Oxford. It was formed at a time when evangelicals in the Church of England were really optimistic about prospects. Approximately 20% of the clerics in the Church of England were evangelicals. So Latimer House became a kind of clearinghouse. There were committees who did studies of relevant doctrinal issues. Packer himself served on many church committees as warden of Latimer House. So what was his vision? I would say it was epitomized by Latimer House, convening committees on studying the doctrines, writing pamphlets. Packer himself became a great writer of pamphlets, 20-page booklets, 30-page booklets. Well, that's a grassroots effort. It is the vision is to educate parishioners and to equip them to conduct ministry in the local church. So that was his vision. Let's just observe that Packer is a belated Puritan, and the Puritans were a great leveling viewpoint, democratic, championing the layperson. That's J.I. Packer. John Stott was upper class. He had a great vision for socializing and having fellowship among clerics. He cultivated a following. John Stott did. He revived an organization for younger clergymen. So Packer wasn't even in the running to be a member of it, but in other ways would have been excluded. Stott was the leader of that group. He cultivated a following. I think we can say that without negative connotation. When I spent 2 days with J.I. Packer in the Crossway offices in 2014, he said several times that he had never cultivated a following, and I think that is right. So Packer's vision was grassroots education at the local level. Stodd's vision was fellowship among clerics and a hoped for trickle-down effect. And I would say this came to a head in the in the 70s actually, when a follow-up to a very successful Kiel conference, 1967, a decade later, was proposed. And Packer at the committee meetings held out for this grassroots effort, educating the layperson. Stott, who carried the day, wanted another rally type conference. So it was held at Nottingham. I would say we see the two visions right there. A big rally with a lot of visibility, educating the layperson through pamphlets.
Amazing. Thank you, Dr. Ryken, for those reflections. Dr. Ryken, in 1970, J.I. Packer published a book entitled Growing into Union. And it was this book that signaled the end of the ministry partnership between J.I. Packer and Dr. Martin Lloyd-Jones. In your view, what happened in this split between J.I. Packer and Dr. Martin Lloyd-Jones?
What happened, let's back up. Packer is maybe unique in his ability to move with equal ease in two Christian communities, the Evangelical Anglican community. We're talking the situation in England. And during the 50s and 60s, the nonconformist tradition, the non-Anglican, the independent churches. Now, the leader of the nonconformist movement was Martin Lloyd-Jones, pulpit in the Westminster Chapel in Center City, London. There had been a long era of cooperation between Packer and Lloyd-Jones. Now, Packer also moved with equal ease in this other group, but the Puritan conferences, which began in the early 50s and lasted until 1970, epitomized this cooperation and the enthusiasm with which Packer was embraced by Lloyd-Jones and the nonconformists. A strain came already in 1966 when Martin Lloyd-Jones delivered an address at a joint conference in the Methodist Central Hall in Center City, London, between evangelical Anglicans and evangelical nonconformists. And Lloyd-Jones made an appeal, and he phrased it as an appeal for unity, for evangelicals in the Anglican Church, and including clerics, to come out of the Anglican Church and join together. We need to be unified, Martin Lloyd-Jones said. That was in 1966. His call went unheeded by both Stott and Packer. But it didn't bring an end to Puritan conferences. They continued for 4 more years. However, the axe fell in 1970 with the publication of a book, Growing into Union. It was jointly authored by Packer and another evangelical low church Anglican and 2 Anglo-Catholics in the Church of England. That they were united in their opposition to a proposed merger between the liberal Methodist denomination and the Church of England, which was predominantly liberal. And the 2 evangelicals and the 2 Anglo-Catholics found themselves in agreement and in opposition to this proposed merger on grounds of doctrinal orthodoxy. Well, they became really excited about their agreement with each other. I think Packer is at heart an ecumenist. Let's just begin with that as a baseline. I think he finds it heartwarming and encouraging to his faith to mingle with people who agree with his doctrinal tradition, but with whom he finds a lot of common ground. So I think these 4 men really got caught up in the excitement of it. They proposed the merger. The merger did not go through. It failed to meet the 75% vote. However, this 200-page book, which Packer did not envision as creating a firestorm, but he did, he called it, a kind of tentative statement, a tract. Well, a 200-page book is not a tract. In any case, it created a firestorm, but not only on all fronts. It created disharmony in the following groups. The liberals in the Church of England were irate and just were abusive to these 4 men on the floor of the conference. That could have been expected. The evangelical Anglicans were up in arms about this book, which found more common ground than they were willing to concede. I should have said that at the outset. Even John Stott was very critical of this book growing into union. So it created great disharmony among the between Packer and the evangelical Anglicans, I should put it that way. But even more, the nonconformist tradition, Martin Lloyd-Jones and his group, just were not on board at all with the Catholic leaning viewpoint expressed in the book. So it was that book that brought an end to the 20-year Puritan Conference. Packer and Lloyd-Jones had virtually no personal contact after that. I found so interesting that John Stott, however, continued to visit Lloyd-Jones regularly, even after the 1966 repudiation by Stott of the proposed coming out of the Church of England. So there was a degree of harshness. People who write on Lloyd-Jones and Packer about the 1970 ending of the Puritan Conference, shunning. I want to just take time out to praise Packer for being an exceedingly generous man. He has repeatedly said to the current day that Lloyd-Jones is the most stellar example of Christianity that he has ever known. So that's really saying a lot about generosity after Lloyd-Jones' shunning of Packer.
And Dr. Ryken, how would you characterize the enduring legacy of this book growing into union?
I think it has no enduring legacy. It created the firestorm. I think it played its part in blocking the merger, or alternatively, the book didn't, because actually the conventicles at Canterbury and York preceded the publication of the book. But the joint effort of these four men had an effect in blocking the merger. I don't think there was any long-term effect other than the disharmony.
Dr. Ryken, J.I. Packer aligned himself with the ECT movement, the Evangelicals and Catholics Together movement, and received quite a lot of criticism for doing so. Why is it that Packer aligned himself with this movement?
Well, I've hinted at one answer. He's an ecumenist at heart. I remember being seated across the lunch table from an editor of Christianity Today, and he said, well, Packer's a great ecumenist. Well, he is indeed. Packer actually answered that question in a column in Christianity Today, and he gave three reasons for joining the movement. He felt a kinship with the Catholics and the Protestants who were part of the movement. He thought it acknowledged a togetherness that already existed. And he said it was an opportunity to join forces against a secular and I would call pagan culture. So common cause against the degeneracy of the times. So he threw himself into the fray. I just would observe with you that I think really dating back to his college years, he enjoyed transcending denominational bounds. Let's go back to the college years. He was converted 10 days after arriving at Oxford University as a student, and it was under the auspices of InterVarsity. Well, InterVarsity is a kind of evangelical melting pot. So I think we can see already back then that Packer personally enjoyed moving among all genuine believers. So he was inclined already by temperament and background to show an interest in evangelicals and Catholics together.
And Dr. Ryken, what were J.I. Packer's hopes for evangelical Roman Catholic dialogue?
I didn't actually ask him that. I will just say about the movement, as Packer was involved in it, that it began as common cause against a common enemy, namely the degeneracy of Western culture. And I think when the opposition quickly arose from non-conforming evangelicals, that the movement morphed from being this combined front against secularism into an ecumenical movement so that the dialogue became the goal. And Packer did not disagree with my assessment on that. I think he hoped initially for a joint front against common enemy. After all, the causes, anti-abortion, let us say, or the opposition to gay, that was a shared viewpoint. So that was the hope, I think. I have not myself been able to uncover any long-term cultural influence of that movement. I want to acknowledge you know more about it than I do.
Dr. Ryken, if I can close our time together with a question that I've been asking all of our interviewees on this program, and that is this: what would it mean for the church to be united? How would we as Christians recognize this unity, and what can we do to pursue this unity?
I'm going to slightly rephrase the question. What would Christian unity look like? And I'm prepared to give you 5 snapshots from the life of J.I. Packer that would answer the question, what would that look like? I'll just say a leading theme in what I'm about to say is unity can exist through parachurch movements. Now, I mean that very loosely as a designation, and even through denominational channels. So I'm prepared to give you 5 snapshots. Let's return to J.I. Packer's college experience. He was converted at an evangelistic service sponsored by the local InterVarsity chapter. Upon conversion, and during his 4 years as an undergraduate, he would say that InterVarsity was the leading spiritual input into his life. Now, the InterVarsity chapter at Oxford was not without its tensions, but we don't need to go into that now. There was a group of Christians from different backgrounds. There were Anglicans in the Christian fellowship, but the Plymouth Brethren were very prominent, for example. So that was a unified group. They were evangelizing at Oxford. Christian unity in the varsity chapter. But I would give is the 20 years of Puritan conferences. That would be a nonconformist or reformed group. The Anglicans didn't warm to it, but within that community, the unity and the excitement and spiritual energy were just unbelievable. Now, it's only by an active imagination that we can see the revival of Puritanism as being the key to spiritual revival, but it was that way. So they had the annual meetings, they had speakers, there was fellowship. The ministers who attended were ready to go back into their local parishes. That's Christian unity. Latimer House in Oxford. Packer was warden at Latimer House for a decade. Well, that's a solidly Anglican effort. It was an attempt to coordinate the efforts of evangelicals in the Church of England, a denominational venture, we might say, but that was Christian unity. They generated tremendous zeal for truth and were making gains in the liberal mainline denomination. They were unified. It was a great time to be alive. Then let's fast forward to Packer's move to America. And again, it was in the Reformed circles that I think his influence was most widespread, Calvinistic or Reformed. So I think of the annual conferences, the Philadelphia Conference on Reformed Theology, for example, where Packer was a stalwart. Or then later, R.C. Sproul's annual meetings. I remember when the Philadelphia Conference was at its high tide, stepping into the narthex at College Church in Wheaton and looking through the glass doors at the evening meeting, the church was packed. The energy, that was Christian unity, and Packer was in the center of it. Neither it nor the Puritan conferences lasted. You need to take that into account. And my final snapshot is one that we could not have predicted. Packer spent half a century in the Liberal Church of England and then the Anglican Church in Canada. I look upon it as, a kind of losing venture. And it appeared that Packer's Anglicanism might be at its end when he was expelled from the church in Canada, but he has reached his finest hour as an Anglican. He is active at the denominational level of the Alternative Anglican Church in North America. That's my label for it. I called him when he was aged 87. He was back from a week on the East Coast and a week on the West Coast doing committee work for the Alternative Anglican Church. In the one case, helping to compose a catechism, and the other a liturgy. Packer is honored in this group. He is listened to. The group has unity. So much as we might be surprised, it's a denominational expression of Christian unity. Now, I infer that perhaps you and people listening to the broadcast would hope for more than that. I want to say, I think the snapshots show that Packer's the Christian unity has emerged most strongly when people begin with doctrinal agreement. And they don't have to feel each other out. They don't have to explore where they agree and disagree. They know they're on the same page, and they can celebrate the truth and disseminate it. By comparison, I would say that Packer's ventures into formal ecumenical dialogue have produced disappointing results and disharmony. I'm not blaming him in the least, but we look at the growing into union, that brought an end to a lot. It closed a lot of doors. Packer's involvement with evangelicals and Catholics together closed a lot of doors. And it's the more parachurch and even denominational efforts of the ones I've described that for me would be the picture of Christian unity. I will also say that one lesson we can carry away in addition, we personally, as Packer personally, can pursue unity wherever we find it. And for Packer personally, these joint ecumenical efforts to explore doctrinal agreement with Catholics and disagreement have been personally rewarding. So he's achieved the unity across the board. But when he's taken the step into formal ecumenical dialogue, he has disaffiliated himself with other groups. And one lesson is a disappointing one. We can't, for Christian unity, we have to affiliate. It doesn't have to be ecclesiastical or organizational even, but we affiliate with a group. And when we affiliate with one group, we seem to close the door to other groups. So that's, a disappointing lesson, but I think it's there.
It's been our honor today to be speaking with Dr. Leland Ryken, former professor of English at Wheaton College and author of J.I. Packer, An Evangelical Life. This is an incredibly rich and detailed life of J.I. Packer. Thank you so much, Dr. Ryken, for joining us today.
You're welcome.